Another theme, as you're all well aware, is the economy. You know, oftentimes Uranus-Pluto is a time of economic downturn and economic transformation. A third theme which I notice is it's also a time of a lot of technological innovation, because Uranus is a problem solver. It forces us to use our ingenuity. And if you happen to be born with a birth chart where Uranus is prominent, then you don't see the world quite like everybody else, and you come up with innovative solutions. And this is a time for people to come up with innovative solutions, because the old ways aren't working anymore. So we don't have a choice. We have to change. The question is, are you going to accept it or fight it? Or maybe, if you're human, a little bit of both. In 1901, 1902, during the opposition, we had a lot of industrial transformation going on. The 1932, 1933 closing square was a difficult time. On the one hand, FDR won his first presidential election, but it was the height of the Great Depression, and it also was the time that Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, and so there were some very difficult things that came out of that period. Then we have a new conjunction, and that was during the mid-60s. And as I started to look at the 60s, I realized that the effects were not just limited to the period that the two planets were exact, but it actually extended during the whole decade. And I listed some of the salient events, and again, this is not an inclusive list. There's many other things that I didn't list, but you sort of get the idea. And for those of you that are old enough to remember, if you're my age, you can remember that the early 60s was a very, very different world than the world that we live in. If you don't remember, then just watch an episode or two of Mad Men, and you get the idea. And the world really was like that. And it was a world where if you were a woman and you wanted to find a job, you went and you used the classified ads. By the way, that's what people did. They used classified ads. And they had to look under the female help wanted section. We had female and male help wanted ads. That's the kind of world we lived in. And it was... And we went from that very quickly to the sexual revolution and the adoption of birth control. And in the early 70s, we had women's liberation, where women were busting out of their traditional roles. All of that in the space of less than 10 years. In terms of going back to the theme of civil rights, well, the heyday of the civil rights movement was in the 60s, in the mid-60s, and that really transformed the landscape, and it really revolutionized our thinking, and we're still dealing with the impacts of that. The 60s was also the time of the Vietnam War. We were very polarized then. I don't know how many people remember, the tension between the long hairs and the hippies versus, the police and the establishment. So people were as polarized then as they are now. Again, we're talking Pluto and Uranus. Pluto tends to like to see things in black and white, and Uranus tends to fragment. So there you go. So is it any surprise that Congress can't make a decision on anything unless they're voting on party lines? Now, conjunctions are very useful to look at, because conjunctions are like the seed. Think of the new moon. The new moon is the seed of the lunar cycle. And whatever you begin during the time of the new moon and shortly thereafter flowers throughout the lunar cycle. This is no less true of the Uranus-Pluto cycle. And you can look at the headlines, see what's going on now. And you can see where some of the activities, some of the actions that were started then are coming to a tension point. And the square aspect in astrology is a tension point. It's like, two planets not playing nice with each other. They're fighting each other. And so that's why you're seeing a lot of pushback in the area of, let's say, reproductive rights. That's why you're seeing some pushback in terms of, voter ID laws and whatnot, which are restricting people's ability to get to the polls. During the civil rights era of the 60s, we were expanding access to voting. Now there's a restriction. So there's a back and forth. There's a tug back and forth. There's a lot of things that are being fought out now, and that's part of the energies taking place. And of course, the way Uranus-Pluto is playing out, that drama is still being written because we're just getting started. Now, from a more spiritual standpoint, because these are outer planets, they push us, they ask us to really evolve, they throw challenges in our way. And for those of you who are being hit head on with these planets by transit, and you know who you are because your life is, shall we say, interesting right now. Topsy-turvy may be another description. You're being asked to grow. You're being asked to let go of outmoded, outworn beliefs, baggage, mental, physical, spiritual. And it's challenging. I'm not going to sugarcoat. Pluto wouldn't let me do that anyway. But on the other hand, those of you who are being challenged the most have the greatest opportunities to grow. This is really a time of personal evolution because the universe is saying things are really out of balance now. This is a time we need you, human beings, to start growing and really grow into your potential, physically, spiritually, etc. And if there's nothing else that you get out of tonight, that's what I want you to get out. That you can really take this energy and you can grow. The old world is changing. That's the message of Uranus-Pluto. You can't stop it if you want to. So because a lot of old systems don't work anymore, because we're seeing the flaws in what's established, this is a time for newness. This is a time for innovation. This is a time for growth. People are going to open up to ideas, solutions, etc., that they weren't open to before because they simply were too comfortable. But now they don't have a choice. And so it forces us to explore things that we didn't really consider in the past, and thereby it enlarges us. So I see this ultimately as a very powerful, positive time. And each of these planets really have a different mode of operating. Uranus, in a lot of ways, is the awakener. When Uranus comes visiting in your chart, meaning that Uranus by transit, Uranus traveling in the sky as it is now, when it's making contact to a planet or angle in your birth chart, which are sensitive points in your birth chart, we experience this as a transit. And if it's Uranus doing the transiting, then you're due for an awakening. Uranus is saying, wake up, don't put up with the mundane, small box that you've put yourself in. It's time to strike out. It's time to think larger. It's time to look at alternatives. It's time to be a little unconventional. It's time for freedom, because Uranus is a planet of the revolutionary. It's a planet of freedom. And when it acts like a bolt of lightning. And that's how Uranian events seem to happen. Like a bolt of lightning is coming. And that can be anything from a flash of intuition to literal bolts of lightning, to technology, because the internet and computers and whatnot are all associated with Uranus, as is astrology, by the way. And of course, revolution, because when Uranus was founded, it was founded roughly around the time of the American and French revolutions, and we know what happened there. So Uranus is saying, wake up, everybody, it's time to wake up. It's time to stop putting up with restrictions. It's time. Then we have Pluto, and the way Pluto works is very different. Pluto's action is to bring things up from underground, and sometimes it literally does deal with the underground, as in mining, for example. It brings up all the hidden stuff so that we can look at it. And usually when Pluto comes calling, it's because there's something that needs to be looked at. Pluto brings up that which is decayed. And I'll give you a perfect example, which will also put into context some of what I'm saying. In 2008, Pluto left the sign Sagittarius, and Sagittarius, among other things, deals with the principle of expansion, and it entered the sign of Capricorn. And Capricorn is the principle of contraction. Capricorn is also the establishment, as in the financial establishment, as in government, as in big business, among other things. And what happened in 2008 when Pluto switched signs? Well, you all heard of Lehman Brothers. That was Pluto saying, hello, I'm in Capricorn now, and we're going to get this house in order. And didn't we shortly thereafter find out just how many shenanigans were going on in the financial sector that we thought was so wonderful and so expansive? And then we found out, well, maybe it was more like a house of cards. And we're still dealing with this because Pluto will be in Capricorn for a long, long time. But it brought this up so that we could look at it, so that we could heal from it, because things were getting to a point where they were so out of balance, they could no longer continue. So that is Pluto's energy in action. Disruptive, absolutely. But ultimately, Pluto is also the consummate healer. But you have to go through the disruption first. That was kind of the opening volley. So you put Uranus, the Great Awakener, which, by the way, I should also mention that Uranus went into Aries in 2010. Aries is the sign of the warrior. So Aries energy is immediate. The reactions of Aries are very immediate. And if you have Aries strongly placed in your chart, your reactions are immediate, and someone who is dealing with you will know right away whether you like something or not. You're very direct. And Aries, I often say about Aries is, sometimes Aries leaps before it looks. So you take that with Uranus, the revolutionary, at odds with Pluto, who is undermining and transforming in the sign of the establishment, and we got some pretty powerful stuff happening. Now, in terms of your own personal lives, Uranus in Aries is also saying, take courage, because Aries is the warrior. It's taking personal courage. It's saying, break out of whatever is closing you in, oppressing you, and break out of that, overthrow that. And when Pluto comes to visit, yes, Pluto often brings disruption, but Pluto also gives you challenges because it wants you to grow into your own power. Pluto is about power, and you learn just how powerful you are when you've experienced a Pluto transit. You learn that you have strength that you never know that you had. And many of us are learning that during this period of time. So this is very, very, very potent. Now, there's one planet that I haven't spoken all that much about, and that is Neptune. Neptune is the third outer planet. And as I said, Neptune works by dissolving. That's how its actions work. But it dissolves, it breaks down barriers, it breaks down boundaries. And if Neptune is strong in your chart, then you want to merge with others, with other things. And in that way, Neptune, if you're using it in a positive way, it's the area where you establish a spiritual connection. And while Neptune is not tied in directly with Uranus-Pluto in this configuration, the way I see it as an astrologer is Neptune is your answer. Neptune is the way out, especially when the going gets real, real intense, like it's been this month. Because Neptune is saying, strengthen your spiritual connection. If you have a strong spiritual connection, you can deal with all this other stuff, because that will get you through. And earlier this year, at the beginning of the year, Neptune went into its home sign of Pisces. And when a planet goes into its home sign, it's able to exert its energy in a much more direct and powerful way. So I don't think it's any accident that Neptune went into Pisces just at the time that Uranus-Pluto really was ratcheting up. So what about this period that we're in now? We're in a very powerful period that actually started well before 2012. And I remember astrologers talking about it years ago. I remember going to an astrology conference, at the turn of the millennium, and they started talking about the end of that decade and all the stuff that was going to go on. And that's when I was first made aware. But if you look at the page which says current timeline, you just get a brief overview. And I would say that the current period that we're living in is really got started in 2007, and it's going to extend well into 2015 and beyond. So we're really in the middle of it. We're in a very concentrated period of intense change, and all the outer planets are active. So hold on to your seatbelts. In 2007, Saturn opposed Neptune. Saturn is the planet of limits, of reality-based thinking, of reality, period. And Neptune, sometimes when Neptune gets going, it likes to paint its own reality, which has nothing to do with the material reality. And at that point, that's when the housing bubble burst. And that was really the beginning of the period that we're in now. And 2008, Pluto entered Capricorn, and I already talked about that. The other big event in 2008 was we had a presidential election, and our first African-American president was elected. That's huge. Now think back. In the mid-'60s, we had the civil rights movement when we decided to get rid of Jim Crow. And we decided to do away with poll taxes and segregation and that sort of thing. That was during the conjunction. Now we're at the time of the first square. And we have our first African-American president. So think about that. There's a theme going on here. And he's up for re-election, and it's 2012. So here we go. And he's got to defend himself on many levels. And then if you go forward, I just enumerate a number of events that have happened, and again, this is not meant to be totally inclusive, but just to give you some flavor. You know, in 2009, the birth of the Tea Party, healthcare reform got passed, the debt crisis begins to unfold in Greece. 2010, Uranus enters Aries, so we're starting to build up more intensity, and we had what the astrologers called a cardinal climax, in that Uranus, Saturn, and Pluto formed a configuration that looked like a giant T, or we call it a T-square. So all three planets were at odds with each other. And in 2011, Uranus and Pluto were dancing closer together. And we had the Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street, Stuxnet, etc. And now we're in 2012. And to paraphrase what Amy was saying before, yes, the world is indeed coming to an end, but it's the world as we know it. No, we're not going to be bombed into oblivion. I don't think so. It may feel like that at times, but really we're not. But the world is going to look very different in the same way that the world changed so markedly from the time of Mad Men to women's liberation. Well, we're in a similar change. It's going to happen in different ways because we're in a different pattern now, but the amount of change, the intensity of change will be that dramatic. And we're right in the middle of things. Now, this past weekend, Uranus and Pluto came to an exact 90-degree angle. But before then, they had been within shouting distance of a square. But now they are exact in the sky. And that means the intensity is that much greater. And Saturn and Pluto, I'm sorry, not Saturn, but Uranus and Pluto, they're going to be dancing back and forth because both planets will go direct and retrograde and move a little further and further. And as one result of the dance is that between now and between 2015, Uranus and Pluto will square exactly 7 times. That's a lot of energy. Now, the way I see that is I see this as such a powerful period, such a deep transformation, that we need this period of time to do it. We can't just do it in one hit. We need to go back and forth. We need to go forward, experience a great deal of change, and then we need to assimilate it and integrate it. And in a lot of ways, what we'll be experiencing and what we already have experienced through this period is energy intensity in a series of waves, meaning that at times things become more intense and at times things ease up some. And one of the ways that we see some ease is when the planets move retrograde. And in the very last handout that I gave you, I don't know that it printed real well. You can see 2012, and you can see what I call my retrograde calendar. And if you saw this in the original color in which it was created, you would see that there's 3 different colors, one for Mercury, one for Mars, and one for Venus. These are showing you the times that the personal planets go retrograde, which is when we feel them the most. The outer planets go retrograde, they're retrograde half the time anyway, so I don't worry about them so much. But when the personal planets go retrograde, we feel them. How many of you know about Mercury retrograde? Even people that don't know anything about astrology know about Mercury retrograde. I get calls, my computer is acting up. Is Mercury retrograde? So if you look at that chart, you're going to see a lot of areas that are shaded where one or more planets were retrograde. And that was because, in my view, this was the universe giving us time to get our act together and to take a deep breath so that we could get ready for things to be intense. And they've been intense. And even now, we're just getting out of this retrograde period. Venus is turning direct today. So it's motionless in the sky right now. It's been retrograde for the last 6 weeks, which was a good time to review some of the important relationships and partnerships in your life, some of your negotiations. And also Venus rules money, so money matters also. You should start to see some easing up of some of that, some of the tensions if you've been feeling that over the next few days. Saturn just went direct on Sunday. Every time a planet switches directions, that's literally a turning point. Last week we had the summer solstice. That's when the sun has reached its northernmost point on the ecliptic, which is its apparent path around the Earth. And now it's switching directions. Instead of moving north, it is now beginning to move south. This brings us calendar summer. And it also means that starting from now, the days are slowly going to shorten in hours of daylight. This is all within a week. And then, just look at some of the headlines. I'm not even going to go there, because I'm sure you've all been following some of the things that have been going on. But this is the kind of energy that's playing out. And many of the things that have been going on have implications that are very deep that we are going to, where we're going to see reverberations that will go through for years and years and years, that are transforming some very powerful institutions and transforming the way we live. And we don't even know the full extent of these implications. And we're just getting started because Pluto and Uranus have 6 more hits to go. So anything that's happening now, it's just the first act. So that gives you an idea of just how powerful the energies are. So in the second to last handout, you can see the exact timing of the Uranus-Pluto hits. And what I want to emphasize is that you should look at this as an indication, but it's not like, for example, the first hit was June 24th, that on June 23rd, everything was perfectly quiet, and on June 24th was the hit, and June 25th it gets quiet again. Think of it more like a bell curve, a curve that rises and falls, and then you'll get the idea. These are peaks, but you know, the energy is going to be high before and after. And I think that the Pluto-Uranus and all the transformative energy will be happening well after the last exact hit. Because we've just released so much energy out there. It's going to take quite a while to percolate and digest. There's some very interesting things going on in 2012. Besides Uranus-Pluto, which I just described, we have a presidential election coming up. And during this presidential election, the presidential election happens to coincide on the day that Mercury turns retrograde for its last time in 2012. Now, the last time that happened was the presidential election of 2000. So now, there's always people that want to know, what do we predict? Who's going to win? That's always a dicey situation for astrologers to get into. What I will tell you is that there was a big astrological conference called UAC that just ended, and what they ended with was a panel of 6 different astrologers coming from 6 different astrological specialties and techniques. And they were asked to give their opinion based on their specialty, who was going to win the election. Now, they unanimously said it was going to be Obama. So you heard it here first. We'll see. We'll see. But will there be irregularities? Will there be some confusion with Mercury turning retrograde? It's very likely. Stay tuned. And with that, I think it might be time for a break. Yeah, we will at the end. We're going to have a break, and then I'm going to be coming back, and then there'll be time for questions, and we'll get into individual charts.